Welcome back to the Already and Not Yet. I'm Tyler James Milliken here with GK Beal, ready to present a special episode on a method of exegesis using the original languages, particularly for Greek and Hebrew. Today, we're going to talk about a special method known as discourse analysis, talk about the importance of sentence flows, and various other methods in Greek exegesis. So, Dr. Beal, glad to have you back with us.
Good to be here.
So first, I thought I'd just remind everyone about the importance of exegesis, particularly if they have the ability to practice that in the original languages. I heard an amazing illustration about someone from the ancient world. This was in the Roman Empire, first century. One of the philosophers was criticizing someone who was claiming to have knowledge and wisdom, although they had not worked through the original texts themselves. This was someone who was claiming to have knowledge in philosophy or poetry like Homer and Plato and all the greats. But instead of studying the sources himself, he was known to have a number of servants that he'd trained to memorize passages. So he would tell one servant, memorize Plato, another one, memorize Homer, and then he'd have these dinner parties and invite his house guests. And he'd try to impress his guests by saying, listen to this amazing passage from Homer. And he'd call one of his servants over and he'd say, remind us about that passage from Homer. And then the servant would recite everything he'd memorized. He'd send him out. He'd call in the one that memorized Plato, recite everything he memorized, then send him out. Now, everyone made fun of this householder because he didn't really know the material himself. He just had a kind of counterfeit wisdom or counterfeit knowledge. And I would warn some of our listeners, maybe even pastors, that there are some people who have a kind of counterfeit wisdom or knowledge that are just relying on commentaries and resources without working through it themselves in the original language. Now, Dr. Beal, I know you and I would both say there's definitely a place for commentaries. We've worked on publications and commentaries ourselves. We encourage our students to use them, but only after they work through the documents in the original languages themselves. So today we'll start off by talking about the importance of discourse analysis. Can you explain to us how important is discourse analysis and where does that method come from?
Well, it's there are a number of definitions of discourse analysis. Stanley Porter talks about them in some of his books, and sometimes discourse analysis is, for example, how to identify paragraph units. Well, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the kind of discourse analysis whereby you focus on a portion of scripture, a paragraph, perhaps even a chapter, and you try to separate out each of those verses or even half verses as propositions, and then you logically relate them. And there's a process whereby, as you do this, you can trace the logical development of thought in the passage and actually find the main point and the secondary main point and the tertiary main point. And that's very important if you're writing papers or preaching or even writing a exegetical essay for a journal or writing a commentary. Now, we can't get into all the weeds of how to do discourse analysis, but if some students want to go to Bible Arc, at the what website is that at, Tyler?
BibleArc.com.
BibleArc.com. There you can find an explanation, as well as, Tyler, do you not have an explanation of some of the discourse analysis methodology at a certain website?
Certainly. We have some videos we can post on your website, so our listeners can find that at gkbeal.com. There's also some great tutorials through BibleArc, as you mentioned, and really they will show people how to conduct a step-by-step logical analysis of the passage leading up to the main point of the text, as you said.
Beautiful. And so I've talked to many people, whether it is pastors or scholars, and if you ask them, how do you find the main point in the passage, a lot of them can't tell you. They might say, well, if the paragraph ends and begins in the same way, there's your main point, and that's helpful. Or if there is a repetition of words, that's the main point. Maybe, maybe not. Or a repetition of a theme. Well, that gets even more subjective. So this procedure is the best one I know of that whereby one can find the main point. I think this is exceedingly crucial.
Yes, and some have even called discourse analysis the bridge between exegesis and homiletics, because this is how we isolate the major points that we bring out in sermons and Bible studies. And it's very helpful because many people don't have a background in classical logic, as we once did back in the good old days, let's say, of classical education. But we also have another method, and that is moving through.
Let me just say one thing before we get to your next point, Tyler, if I may.
Please.
And that is that when you find the main point in your discourse analysis, you should state that main point in a full sentence. We call an exegetical idea. And then, as you say, one of the things that keeps me teaching is this is important for preachers. Once you get your exegetical idea based on the discourse analysis, then you can formulate that into a shorter homiletical idea, yes, whereby number one, you shorten the sentence, number two, you personalize it, and number three, state it more as a principle. So I just wanted to kind of put those finishing touches on there, Tyler.
Yeah, that's very helpful because that'll be the capstone of the discourse analysis to get that homiletical point. And we also have another method. If we talk about the discipline of sentence flows, how does that help students and preachers and teachers to move through the text in the original languages?
In sentence flows, what you do is you find your main ruling grammatical phrase, and then you find your other phrases that modify it, and you put them below and to the right of what they modify in the main ruling phrase. In the main ruling grammatical phrase, you'll have a subject, typically, a verb, and an object. Not always, but usually. And all the other phrases after those three parts of the ruling phrase are modifiers of either the subject, the verb, or the object. We can formulate that into the Lord's Prayer of sentence flowing. Find the subject, the verb, and the object, and all else will be added unto you. And so all other modifiers are put below and to the right of either the subject or the verb or the object. Now, that not only causes you to be sure that you are identifying all the grammatical aspects of a passage, and by the way, this is not a sentence diagram. It's not as complex. This is more sensitive to the literary flow of the argument. And as a result, once you finish a sentence flow, you can often break it down into different parts. It'll actually help you to find the subdivisions of your paragraph. And that itself then will give you a 3-point sermon, for example, or a 2-point sermon, however it goes. So this is very important. And I do want to put a footnote that not everybody knows the languages. And so I would say that you can do discourse analysis and sentence flowing in English. It's not going to be as precise or as accurate, but nevertheless, it will be very helpful. And so I would encourage those that don't know Greek and Hebrew to be able to try to do this, because the Word of God is important, and we want to be accurate when we convey it.
Yes, and to that end, I think both of these disciplines are a way that we can let the text set the agenda, because whether it's in English or whether it's in the original languages, this is a way in which we can trace the logic of the text and follow the structure of the text. And we'll actually have a template on the website. If people want to visit your site, they can get the full template to see each page and each step of this exegetical method. But the next thing I'd like to do is sort of lay out for our listeners step by step how one piece of the exegetical method builds toward the next one. So if we start with sentence flows, as you said, we're kind of looking at a hierarchy of major items and supporting items in the original Greek text. And students can work through that. Could be in English, but ideally in the original language first. And this is preparatory to let the text set the structure of the agenda for the rest of the exegesis. And then the second thing that we would have students do in our seminary courses is produce their own English translation. Now, this is another place where, again, people can reference published translations. Later on, we'll talk about a method where they can actually compare several translations and produce what we call a version comparison. But this would be the second step. in preparation for the discourse analysis. So, Dr. Beal, any additional comments here on these first two steps, sentence flows and translations, and how these prepare for the discourse analysis?
I don't think so. If you do your translation, then that should set you up to do your flow. And I would say that the translation, if you don't know Greek and you want a more direct translation to work with to set you up for your English flow, that you should use the New American Standard Bible or the ESV or the New King James or the Holman Christian Bible.
Yes, NASB is tried and true as sort of a direct equivalent translation. I know some of our listeners are quite fond of the new variant, the Legacy Standard Bible as well, which is built on, I think, the same translation approach as the NASB. Now, one of the finishing touches here in step 2 with our translations is the students will begin to highlight the logical connectors and the keywords, the conjunctions, or what we might call the signal words that begin to show us the logic of the passage. And that prepares us for the discourse analysis itself. So this is step 3 of our method out of 7 pieces here. And this is where we begin to isolate those main points and supporting points. Now, we can't necessarily go into all the details here. Again, people can see the template on your website. But just to reinforce, what we're doing at this point is we're looking at the rhetorical main point from the author here. What is the author placing in the foreground? And how is it articulated in the passage with these main points and supporting points in the text? So, Dr. Beal, any additional thoughts here about discourse analysis?
No. I think just go to Bible Art to kind of get into the details and your comments on my website on logical propositions.
Right. And if they've actually completed this discourse analysis, the 4th step would be, as you said, to boil that down into what we call the exegetical main point and then the homiletical main point.
Right.
And this is a very important transition because on the one hand, we have exegesis, which is done in the workshop, so to speak, in the study. But then we have to translate that exegetical main point into our application for preaching or teaching and even for our own study. So this is where we would look at direct application, not just how did Paul apply this or whomever in the ancient world, but how would we apply this in our modern world? So that would be our 4th step before we look at a version comparison. So, Dr. Beal, any additional thoughts here as we turn toward version comparison?
Not on that. So I do have some. I think it's very important now that we look at English translation comparison.
Yes, and so this is actually method where we bring up 4, maybe 5 mainline, well-regarded English translations. People can do this in their original language if they're not English language first, but we have numerous high-quality English translations we can compare here. And we would essentially go through line by line, maybe with, say, 4 parallel columns. And we would highlight what are the major translational differences from one version to the next. So people might pull up the ESV next to the NIV and so forth. And the main thing that we're looking for at this point in the process is to compare our own exegetical work with what is shown up in the mainline translations. And so mainly we're looking at theological differences or high impact translational differences, anything that would affect the interpretation or the application of the passage. So, Dr. Beal, additional thoughts here?
Yes, this is very important. And I would say in the chart, it's probably best to do more direct translations like New American Standard, HCSB, ESV, New King James. But I think it would be important to look at the NIV, the New Jerusalem Bible, some of the more interpretive paraphrases as well. And you highlight the differences, and it's right at that point, often the differences will give you indications where there are interpretive problems in your passage. If, for example, a word is from Greek is translated differently by different translations, that shows you there's a word study problem. For example, perhaps in Ephesians 1:13, for example, maybe it's 1 14, where it talks about the Holy Spirit being the arabone, the down payment of our inheritance. Well, some translations might have down payment, some might have guarantee, some might have beginning, some might have some form of the metaphor for seal, which is carried over from the verb. A number of differences could result in the different translations. When you see that, you know you've got a word study problem and you need to do a word study, because those translation committees saw the problem and they came out with different conclusions on how to translate that word. And I would add that there are other different kinds of interpretive problems that these translations can reveal. For example, when you find love of God, which will usually be translated like that in the more direct translations of the NASB or ESV. But sometimes, even in the direct translations, but especially in translations like the NIV, you'll find that love of God is sometimes translated as love for God, love by God, divine love. And what does that mean? That means we have a syntactical exegetical issue. Syntax is the relation of words. So in that case, it's a matter of how to interpret the genitive. So these translations will also reveal syntactical issues. They can also reveal issues of a logical nature. Some logical words, like ahina, may be translated in order that, or with the result that. And one needs to be careful. A haughty may be translated as a that, or it could be translated as a because. And if those are different translations, so those do make a difference in the meaning. And so we could go on and on here, but those are a few examples of how the translations can make us aware of the interpretive problems in a passage. That's why it's so important to compare them.
Right. It's extremely important. And I'm always impressed by how relatively quickly a translation comparison can uncover numerous items to clarify your study. Sometimes it'll help people to review their own exegetical work that they've already done. Sometimes it opens up new problems and new questions that they realize they need to address. And I like that we place this at step 5 out of these 7 steps, because we've already started to work through the passage. And so at this point, it allows us to sort of reflect on our work and then see what further progress we need to make. Well, we could certainly say more there, but we have step 6, which I know is one of your favorites and mine, which is to look at the cross references in the critical text of the Nestle-Aland 28th edition. This is a very powerful study resource. And Dr. Beal, I'd love for you to speak to this step in the process.
It's very important that as a pastor or a student is going through these 7 steps, at this 6th step, it's very important to look at the Nestle-Aland margin, the right side, the left side of your page, and to actually manually write down the references, because that'll make you make yourself aware of what these references actually are. Now, the reason this is important, there's several. Number one, these references will help you do what I call marginal theology, marginal biblical theology. That is, interpreting from the margins. This is not some kind of woke interpretive method, but it is what it does. For example, it will reveal to you, you'll have Old Testament references. Now, even when you don't have a quotation, if there's an allusion, they'll put that Old Testament allusion in the margin. And you need to go and decide, is it really allusion? I'd say about 75% of the Nestle-Aland references to allusions are, but I don't agree with them all. And the way you find that out is, in this case, if you know Greek, you put in the word combination of your New Testament passage, which is supposed to have the allusion, put that into the Greek Old Testament, and see where it pops up. And if it only pops up in that passage, that means this is unique. And that means it's more likely than coincidence that the author has drawn the reader's attention to this once occurring language from the Old Testament. And then you, at that point, do your interpretation of the New Testament use of the Old Testament. And here I would recommend, I'm embarrassed to do so, self-serving, but I recommend
I need your handbook, Doc.
my short handbook, handbook, the New Testament use of the Old Testament. So that's very, very important to be able to catch these allusions, because if you want to interpret redemptive historically, that is, interpret in light of the place in biblical history where your New Testament author is and what he's saying about that place, you want to do New Testament use of the Old. And that's true, especially with not just quotations, but also the allusions. I would want to say a lot more about that. But by the way, there are different ways, or at least 10 different ways that New Testament writers use the Old Testament. I have a chapter on that in the handbook as well, the uses and illustrations of them. But as well, these margins will reveal to you very important New Testament parallels. These parallels will either enlighten your passage, or they may pose a problem that needs to be discussed. So that's another issue. For example, let's say you're in the book of Revelation. It'd be important to look at the references elsewhere to the New Testament, especially in the Gospels, because the book of Revelation uses the Gospels quite a bit.
Yes.
And there you would want to go back to the Gospels and what Jesus meant by the saying in its context. Those are some important facets. Tyler, you want to add anything?
Certainly, there's so much that we could say here, but the first thing that I would just underscore is the use of the Old Testament in the New. As you said, this is really a whole discipline that people can study. And this is where they'll pick up on the echoes and allusions and quotations from the Old Testament. Very often we're looking at promises and prophecies and fulfillments, but there's many other uses as well. So that's very important to our study. But those New Testament parallels are also very helpful sometimes in the internal structure of parallels within a New Testament book itself. So I'll just share one example from my research commentary on James. I spent some time working through the Greek text of James from start to finish, numerous times, trying to uncover structural parallels and themes throughout the book, just from chapter 1 through 5 over and over again, to share for our listeners how powerful these citations and resources are in the cross-references of the NA28. After I did my original work, I checked the cross-references database, and they probably already contained 90% of what I uncovered with my own work. Not all of them, but it covers so much so quickly that if people turn to these references first, they will find a wealth of resources there, and then you can do your additional work on top of that.
I would want to comment too that the students who don't know Greek, I encourage them to still nevertheless buy the Nestle Aland Novum Testamentum Graeci, New Testament Greek, 28th edition. You can get it on Amazon, and it's going to be probably $35 or $40. But this in itself, even though you don't know Greek, you can use the margins. I know someone who is a pastor in Maine. He doesn't know Greek, but he bought that New Testament and he uses the margins to help him in his preaching.
Yes, indeed. It's extremely helpful. And we may even post one last resource for our listeners. We actually have a shortcut summary of how to understand those cross-references. We'll put that on the website with this episode as well, so they can get that in the news section. Well, we have one last piece, and this is sort of the capstone of our standard exegetical assignment. All of our seminary students go through this process. And here on the 7th page, they're going to provide a summary of the logical development of the passage. And this is sort of a reflection on the whole flow of thought throughout the passage. Now that we've worked through the passage from all these different angles, we can summarize the logic, spell out all the main point and supporting points in the structure of the passage. And this is sort of a way of spelling out the discourse analysis in paragraph form, But now we're bringing in all the insights that we've collected from every other step, whether it's version comparison or sentence flows and everything else. So Dr. Beal, what would you add here with this final step?
No, it's just this step actually reveals whether you understand the logical development in the passage. It forces you to spell this out in a way that you would say it in an exegesis paper, or say it in a Bible study, or say it in a sermon.
That's right. So I think this is the last and crucial step, which is not only must we understand it in the workshop and in the study for ourselves, but we have to be able to translate that in our sermons and Bible studies for all of our listeners. And so this is just a good chance to put things in our own words and make it accessible so that everyone can benefit from the passage. Well, there's so much more that we could say. In a future episode, we're going to talk more about that discipline of the New Testament use of the Old Testament, which is a whole discipline in itself. But until then, thanks to everyone for listening. This is the Already and Not Yet. And we'll see you next time here with myself and GK Beal.